Hello, welcome to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay, and today our studio guest is David Lorimer. Hi, David.
Hi, Ian. Very nice to be here.
And David's really quite a character. A few years ago, my wife Renata and I joined the Scientific and Medical Network, and we get every few months we get a magazine, which Network Review, which we love to look through, and in particular, what I love is all the book reviews, and it seems that most of them are written the reviews by David. And it seems that he reads hundreds of books every 3 months. We'll find out if that's true or not. But that was the catalyst for me wanting to get David along to find out more about him. Now, I also know he's very diverse. He's written a book about Prince Charles, the Radical Prince. He was also the compiler and editor for a book, Learning for Life, which is quite inspiring. And also Beyond the Brain, A Wider Science of Consciousness. Again, he's the compiler and editor of that book. I know he's written and been involved with other books as well. But we're basically going to start with your life. And you were telling me earlier that your mother was actually quite clairvoyant, which must have been interesting as a young child.
That's right. Well, I think my father was very sceptical about religion, spirituality, that sort of thing. But my mother was very open and interested, and had a lot of experiences herself from quite an early age, right the way through her life. And so she took it for granted that we lived in a wider reality, that consciousness survived death, that perhaps we had been other lives, reincarnation was a possibility. And what I find interesting when I was talking to her about this was that a lot of the things that she said turned out to be true, turned out to have been true. So, for instance, I think there's one when she was going to go for a job at some point, and she had a dream about the place that she was going to, which she'd never seen before. And when she arrived at the place, she recognised it as the place that she had seen in her dream before she'd even gone there. And so if you have someone like that in your family who you respect and love, and they have experiences like this, it does make you question whether life is as conventional science insists it is, that we live in a totally material universe. So I've never really believed that, partly on that basis.
So really from early days of childhood, you had a view that was probably quite different from other children at the time, your contemporaries.
Well, it's not the sort of thing one talked about at school. But yes, I suppose that I became aware of this probably in my teens. I don't think that these sort of things were not talked about very much, when I was very small. And as I say, my father took a different view, and his background was that he had been in Burma for quite a long time before the Second World War. He went out there in 1926, and so he was influenced to some extent by Buddhism, though he had a great respect for Buddhism, even though he didn't believe in any kind of religion. So he had a Buddha in his bedroom, which I've now got. Which was rather fun. And his, just to say, give a little bit of a more interesting background on both sides of the family. My grandfather was a famous architect in Scotland, Sir Robert Lorimer, and he designed the Thistle Chapel in Edinburgh, which celebrates its centenary next year, and also the National War Memorial. And he was a person of extraordinary vision and understanding of nature. So he's very intuitive, but also he had a very strong feeling for nature, so that I understand that when guests came for the weekend, he got them up in the summer. He got them up to listen to the dawn chorus. That says something about him. And when he went to Chartres, he was so overwhelmed by the beauty of Chartres that he burst into tears. And he's not the sort of person enthusiast. And then his father was Professor James Lorimer, and he was a professor of international law at Edinburgh University. And he's a very interesting person. I've been inspired by him. He was 1818 to 1890, and he became Professor of International Law in Edinburgh University in 1862, which is a chair he held until his death. He had extensive European connections, and so he had doctorates, honorary doctorates from Bonn, Bologna, and Moscow. And these all hang at Kelly Castle, which is a place that he restored, which is near where we live. And he wrote, his major book was called The Institutes of the Laws of Nations, 1881, in 2 volumes. I can't say I read the whole thing. It's a very interesting book because it prefigures the development of the idea of the League of Nations and the United Nations. So he had these ideas as early as the 1880s. He was also a moral philosopher, and so he corresponded with John Stuart Mill and various of the other prominent thinkers of the time. And so he's very much a man of international outlook, and that's what inspired me about him.
So as a child, did you regard yourself as like a sensitive child? Were you kind of, you're obviously quite drawn into a literary world in terms of finding out more about how the world worked. Where was this leading you at that age, do you think?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I was sensitive, and as sensitive people quite often happens, it means you're picked on by your contemporaries. And so that wasn't a particularly comfortable position to be in. But in fact, you won't believe this, but my mother found it very difficult to get me to read anything. And I did read a certain amount at school when one had to, and I remember reading, when I was 12, I read a 5-volume history of the Spanish campaigns of Wellington. And I can't remember anything about that. But then when I was 13, she got me to read a book by Margaret Irwin called Royal Flush, and I just couldn't put it down. And so after that, I then started reading quite a bit, but nothing like what I read now, what I've read in the last 20, 25 years. And so I think the book that really got me thinking, along the lines that we're talking today, was a book by Justin Glass. And I'm just trying to remember what it was called, but I got it out of the library at Eaton, where I was at school, my last term. So this would be 1970, and it was a book about experiences of various sort of paranormal type, which have been collected into this by the author. And what it did was it gave me the first reference point I had for my mother's experiences. In other words, before that, I just had my talking to her and what had happened with her. And after that, I was then able to see, well, these similar sort of things are happening to other people, and therefore there must be a way of understanding this, a way of looking at this, and implications of precognition or clairvoyance or telepathic dreams or telepathy or whatever, all of which I've been fascinated by.
So you were fascinated, but you hadn't actually had experiences of this at that time?
No, I did I had a very strong feeling of the sacred, if I can put it that way, when I was being confirmed.
So what does that mean, a strong feeling of the sacred?
Well, I just felt I remember kneeling in the chapel during the confirmation service, and I just felt very connected to something other than myself. So I had a sense of, if you like, of deeper reality.
Yes.
But it was rather channeled, if you can see, because the person who did our confirmation was called Reverend Sadler, and his nickname was Honey Bunch, and he's a very sweet man. I think hence the nickname. And actually, it wasn't so much what he said that was important, but how he was. He's a very gentle man, and obviously his Christianity meant something very deeply to him, and he embodied it, and so that you pick up as well. But my main discipline at school and university was long distance running, and
really?
I did a lot of that. So that's something, and I can remember a lot of times being in.
So why did you enjoy that?
I love running in nature. I must say I find it much less fun running around a track. But if you're good at cross country, then you get put on the track anyway. And so
see, a lot of people when they say that when they go long distance running, they feel something happens in terms of kind of it opens something up and a connectedness appears.
Yes, I think you do get I can actually picture myself and remember specific runs where I had a feeling of almost ecstasy, actually.
Yeah.
And also, when you get into the flow when you're running, then that sense of rhythm. I remember at an occasion when I was in France, and I ran a very fast kilometre, and it just felt terrific. It was just, and so the flow, and I won the school steeplechase at Eaton by nearly 5 minutes, and so by 3/4 of a mile, and so it was a wonderful feeling to be able to do that. And that then continued into university, and so I won the British University's steeplechase in 1972, and I ran for Scotland and British universities and Scottish universities, and so that discipline, if you like, was a very important part of my young period.
What was it like for you going to Eaton? Obviously, people who don't know, who are watching overseas, Eaton and Harrow are the two most famous public schools in England. And they're called public schools, but actually they're very expensive private schools.
That's right.
What's it like going and being with, really, you're with presumably pretty smart kids, and then you're certainly with kids who've come from very successful families financially.
Yes.
What's that like?
Well, of course, it's. I do go back there occasionally. I went back for my 40th dinner, 40 years after leaving earlier this year, which is a wonderful occasion. And I got a huge amount out of Eton. I think one of the really important things is as soon as you arrive, you have your own room. You have your own study bedroom. And I think that encourages individuality. It encourages you to, be yourself and not be quite so subject to peer pressures. I mean, there's a lot of peer pressures in adolescence in any school, as we all know from our own experience. But it does so that, there's a very diverse, one of my contemporaries was Jonathan Porritt. For instance, he was a couple of years older, but, it shows what different kinds of character, can come out of the same place. And so I think developing individuality is very, very important there. And you obviously get to know your contemporaries very well, and the facilities. I think if I had my time again, I would work a lot harder than I did. Actually, I didn't work very hard.
I think we all
yes. I spent a lot of time playing games, because I also played squash for the school, and fives, Eaton fives, which was originally invented against the chapel. That's how it actually started. And so, but it's a very beautiful place, like Winchester, where I taught later on. And so you also absorb the atmosphere and the history of the place, and a sense of continuity that, you're one generation going back to 1440. So it's an immense privilege, and the education was second to none.
And then I know that we might be going on a few years here, but you thought of becoming a priest at one time. You had a good friend that was a priest, and you thought it was calling.
That's right. Now, that goes on to the time when I had left St Andrews, and I came back down south, and I was living in Denham, outside London, in a family house, and I was working in the city at the time at a merchant bank called Morgan Grenfell. My father thought
you were actually a banker at the time.
I was a banker. Yes.
So was that kind of going to be your career when you went into that?
Well,
did you feel that was
I was
life?
very lucky to get the job, because the other three people who got jobs all came from Oxford that year, and I was at St Andrews, and St Andrews was considered a bit of an outpost. But I obviously, passed through the interview things, a terrifying kind of interview. And my father thought this was the great thing I should be doing. He was very comfortable with the idea that his son would be a merchant banker. It's a respectable thing to say at cocktail parties. But I almost immediately knew that this was not actually, I was a square peg in a round hole. It wasn't right for me. However, it was extremely good training in business, in sort of the matters of doing business and actually having a job and being disciplined and all that. But yes, what happened was I realised that I didn't want to continue as a merchant banker. I projected forward to when I would be 70, and I thought to myself, do I want to look back on a career as a banker? And the answer was immediately no. And so that set me thinking, well, what do I want to do? And so I thought, I had a mentor at that stage called Norman Coburn. And he was a very interesting person who'd been canon at St Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh. So there was a connection with Edinburgh. He did his PhD in Edinburgh on Origen, who believed in reincarnation. He was a member of the Swedenborg Society, and he had a huge collection of books all over his house and in his garage. It was more books than I'd ever seen anywhere. And so I asked him, I was thinking even of becoming a priest in the Swedenborg church, because I was being influenced by...
So for people that don't know, who is Swedenborg?
Swedenborg is an extraordinary 18th century scientist, philosopher, inventor, mystic. He was one of the great figures of the 18th century. His dates are 1688 to 1772. He spent first half of his life, up till the time he was 55, doing science and mathematics and engineering, and he was a government engineer. He sat in the upper house of the parliament in Sweden as well. So he's a very practical person. And then in 1743, his inner senses opened, and suddenly he was able to see through the material world into other dimensions. And the two things that he did, he then wrote a huge series of books from then until his death in 1772. And some of these are reports of conversations that he had with people who died.
So when you say other dimension, that means going on beyond our physical plane.
Indeed.
And so you're in touch with spirits that of people that have died and...
Exactly. He was.
Okay.
And the extraordinary, he wrote all his books in Latin. And
Right.
Everything's a terribly matter of fact. And so I was amazed when I first read this, in my last term at university, to find somebody who was so matter of fact, talking about things that people don't regard as matter of fact at all. So when he was describing what most people would think, these extraordinary experiences, he was describing them as if he was on a shopping trip.
So it's completely normal to him.
Yeah, it's completely normal.
Yeah.
And so there's one, maybe I'll just give you one example of a story that that intrigued me enormously, and this was the Madame de Marteville's receipt. What happened is that the Baron de Marteville had died, and his widow received a bill from a tradesman saying that she owed him some money, and he was sure that her husband had paid the bill. But she couldn't find the receipt, she couldn't prove it. And so she told the story to Swedenborg, and Swedenborg says, well, I'll see what I can do. And then a week later, he comes back to Madame de Marteville and says, I've spoken to your husband, and yes, he said he did pay the bill, and the receipt's in a secret drawer in his bureau. And here's where the drawer is. And so they pulled the drawer out, and there was another drawer inside. Inside was the receipt. Now, this is an extraordinary and significant piece of evidence, because nobody nobody alive actually knew about the existence of this drawer, let alone the receipt. And so there are only two explanations you can bring forward here. One is that Swedenborg sort of read it out of the Akashic record, read this information out of the Akashic record. Or the second one, the obvious one, is that he did communicate with the man. The man told him where it was. And so this is evidential, as they say in the trade.
When you mention Akashic records, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's a form of it's a phrase that people use about there being a universal memory record of everything that has happened and everything that people have thought in the history of the universe. It's a Hindu idea. It's been taken up by Irving Laszlo.
Is that
more
something
recently.
that you have experience with at some...
No, I don't think so. But I was just sort of giving you a bit of background about Swedenborg. Okay. So anyway, so I said to Norman, what do you think I should do? Because he was a priest, and he said, well, I think you should think of going as a priest into the Church of England, because if you go into Swedenborg Church, then it'll be pretty marginal. You'll be going into a backwater. And so I said, okay, I'll go and investigate this. And so I went up to Oxford for the weekend. to a place called St. Stephen's House. There are 3 places you can go in Oxford to study theology in order to become a priest. And the really important conversation I had with the tutor called John Cobb, he said that it was quite likely that during my training and my theology degree, I would lose my faith. And I was absolutely astonished. And here was a man, the tutor, saying that while we were going to be studying theology, it would probably cause me to lose my faith. And then I also realised that this wasn't really the right path for me once I reflected on the car on the way back to Denham.
So what did faith mean to you at that point?
Well, what faith meant to him was 39 articles and the doctrines of the Church of England. So that's what I understood he meant, and so I meant it more, roughly in that sense. But faith, what I now mean by faith is, and I must have had the germ of that at the time. What I now mean by faith is trust in the beneficence of the universe.
Right. Yeah.
That things do work out, will work out, can work out, and that there is an underlying dynamic and process and purpose of which we are a part.
Did you feel that at the time, the beginning of that?
Yes, I did. Well, it was interesting because I suppose I was in the process of becoming a heretic, in a way, because I found it difficult to tick the boxes, and I think a lot of people find this. And then they stand up in church and say the Nicene Creed. Do you really believe this when you say it? Can you really, hand on heart? I think a lot of people find that very difficult, and yet, the creeds themselves, interestingly, were created in order to exclude heretics, because the heretics couldn't say the creed because they didn't actually believe it. And so it's a really fascinating episode in the history of ideas, the history of theology, that the fathers who formulated the creeds, it's like a kind of legal document, or a treaty. And they were very reluctant to do this, but they realized that they had to put these things into words in order to deal with the heretics, who then wouldn't be able to say these things because they didn't believe them. So I'm not a literal believer either. I never have been.
Okay, so that was a decision you made, that you didn't want to become a priest.
Exactly.
But you were still working as a
yes,
banker,
and then
so...
the next important thing that happened was I had a friend who was teaching at Charterhouse, and he still is, actually. And so I went down to spend a night with him to find out how he was getting on. This must have been in 1975. And I thought that how his life and the fact he was doing sport and he was interacting with young people and he was teaching something he loved, this really appealed to me. And so I then decided that I would do a PGCE, Postgraduate Certificate of Education, at Cambridge in 1977 to 78. However, this meant that I wanted to polish up my languages again, and so I was going to spend a year abroad. And this year abroad, which was 76 to 77, was absolutely critical in my whole story and development. Because I'd started reading a lot, while I was at Morgan Grenfell. I remember one day, Quentin Davis, who's now a peer, he came in and saw Bertrand Russell or something on my desk, and he said, "I'm always interested to see what you're reading, David. I terribly agree with you. Life's far too short for trash." And so he never saw me reading any trash. It was always something instructive and probably, I suppose, quite academic. So I was beginning to build up a bit of a library by then, and what I then did was I selected 4 boxes of books to take abroad with me, and loaded them into my Fiat 127, and I read all of those books over the next year, and they included Jung, big amount of Jung, Radhakrishnan, he was president of India and Eastern philosopher at Oxford, Spengler, Decline of the West, J.G. Fraser, The Golden Bough, Arnold Toynbee, The Study of History, abridged edition, but the abridged edition is still 1,000 pages. And a huge, and psychology and other bits of philosophy and religion and anthropology and, 4 boxes. And that was my reading for the year.
What were you looking for at that time, do you think?
I was looking for a synthesis of understanding, because like many people, I read Colin Wilson's book *The Outsider*, which a lot of people have read, and most people who've read it have been tremendously influenced by it. And I wasn't any different. I was also very influenced by it. But maybe unlike some people, what set me off doing was to start reading all the references in his book. And so I started reading Dostoevsky and Blake and Toynbee and Spengler, and because the next book was called *Religion and the Rebel*, and there were even more things in that. And Hermann Hesse as well. So that really sort of set me off and provided me with an enormous reading list. So I think and then I spent this year abroad, which is this really seminal year, and I spent part of it very congenially showing people around champagne cellars at Moët-et-Chandon, which is something I'd done in earlier years as well. And then I also spent 3 or 4 months in Heidelberg, and I had a whole period leading up to Christmas where I was able to really read what I liked, attend a few lectures, and listen to the wonderful bells, and just enjoy Heidelberg and being a student in Heidelberg.
I remember Heidelberg, yeah, very beautiful, lovely walks there.
So that really set me up for the next year. And then when I arrived at Cambridge in September 1977, this is where the sort of some new spiritual things started happening, is I trained in TM.
Okay.
And but I think you got a special student rate, as far as I remember, because
it didn't cost much.
It didn't cost so much.
TM as well, yeah.
And so that was the first time when I did any kind of regular practice like that.
Did that change things for you?
That did, yes. I still remember my mantra, which one shouldn't forget. I don't do that particular meditation very often anymore, but it really started me off, and
So how did it affect you practically doing the meditation?
It made me a lot calmer.
Yes.
In myself, and I could feel that when I was doing it, and also when you're going about your daily activity, you just have a background of calm in your mind. You don't get so agitated. There aren't so many waves going around. So I found that was really new. It was new for me. I'd never done anything like that before.
Do you still meditate?
Yes, I do.
What kind of meditation do you do now?
Well, it's not a kind, really. I mean, I do. It's silent meditation. I do. Sometimes I meditate, as it were, on the core qualities of the Peter Deunov material. We haven't come to that yet.
Yes. Well, okay, because I'm breaking away from the sequential nature.
Yes.
So let's keep it in sequence.
So we'll come on to that. Maybe I'll mention it. I'll mention it when we come onto that. And then the next thing I think which is important for our kind of narrative is that I got a job at Fettes College in Edinburgh with my old headmaster, Tony Chernovich-Trench, who had been headmaster of Eaton while I was there, and that was very wonderful opportunity because it meant that I was quite close to home, Fife, but I was in Edinburgh and I had a lot of friends in Edinburgh, and I had this wonderful room at the top of the tower, which is 127 steps. Which was meant your memory improved because you didn't want to leave too many books behind with 127 steps to go up. And I had these amazing views over Edinburgh, straight over the castle and St Mary's Cathedral, down to North Berwick, and then out to the Pentlands on the other side. And so that was a very good time. And during that time, I started to meditate a bit with Brahma Kumaris. This must have been spring '77, I think. So my 78, sorry, spring '79. And they had an office in Edinburgh. Brahma Kumaris was founded, for the readers, viewers are not familiar, in the 1930s by a retired jewellery maker called Brahma Baba. And he had a form of meditation which is called Raj Yoga, which is open eye meditation. And so I started getting up very early in the morning, like 5 o'clock, in order to go to the other side of Edinburgh and drive to the other side of Edinburgh for an hour's meditation session. And then I drove back. And at that point, the Brahma Kumaris, they stipulate you have to be a vegetarian. And so I became a vegetarian. And viewers who've become vegetarians know that your family doesn't always appreciate you becoming a vegetarian. Right. And so that can get you into quite a bit of trouble. But it's also a matter of standing up for what you believe in.
But let's go back to the meditation.
Yes.
That's a lot. That's a long time to meditate, an hour, when you're a novice. How was that for you?
It is. Well, it got easier, I think, is the answer.
Did you have lots of thoughts?
Yes. We all have these thoughts going around, and you just have to. Once we were taught that really in TM as well. That when you have all these thoughts going around, you just don't pay any attention to them. You can watch them floating past, but you then come back to your breath or back to your mantra, and so the same sort of thing applied. But what you also did in that particular one was that the teacher would be sitting up on a platform, and you were down. I've never managed to be comfortable cross-legged. I know some people are very flexible, but I found that excruciating. And then there's a message every day called a murli. So I kept this up for 2 or 3 months, I think. Then I decided that the wonderful people I met, and I still know quite well some Brahma Kumaris, but I decided it just wasn't for me. It was just not right for me. And I was influenced in that by reading Jung, who said that people in the West should try to find a spiritual practice that is in context in the West, that comes out of the Western spiritual tradition. I mean, one could disagree with that, but somehow that spoke to me. I've somehow intuitively understood that this was what I was looking for. And it was quite some time before I actually came across what I now still am involved in to some extent, which is the Peter Deunov Bulgarian.
So tell us about Peter Deunov.
Well, I just go back one stage earlier, because this is about 25 years ago. This is 1985, when I was already teaching at Winchester. So I had a house down there. I was also teaching a bit of philosophy at Winchester, and I came across this book called The Cosmic Moral Laws by Omram Mikhail Ivanov. And Ivanov was originally a pupil, student of Peter Deunov. And then I bought, as you can imagine, I bought all his complete works. And so this was 30 volumes of large white books and another 30 volumes of multicoloured books. And I read them all. And in the chapter 2 about the second book, there is a beautiful short biography of Peter Deunov, and I saw him looking out of the page at me, as it were. This beautiful, refined face and long white hair, with a background of the mountains. And when I read about him, I thought, this is just wonderful. I've got to find out more about this.
So what attracted you initially to him?
I suppose it's my feeling for him. It's a vibration, if you like. And it was something... and also the simplicity of his approach and his teaching, and eventually the fact that it's also an ecological spirituality. The mountains are terribly important. And so it's not just an inner work. And music is very important. Singing is important. Movement is important. So what happened was I then found that there was very little in English, practically nothing. But I found that there was a small group in France who were publishing stuff in French. And as I was teaching French, I bought the whole run, about this much again, of everything Peter Deunov, and some books in French, and I read all those as well. And the more I found out, then I went down to the south of France, to Fréjus in 1985, to spend a week at Ivanov's camp, his headquarters there. So there were a lot of people there, and that was extremely interesting. But when I came back, I realized that my commitment, if you like, was to Peter Deunov primarily, rather than to Ivanov. And so I then came across a Bulgarian woman in my local village in Cotswolds, where I was living. And so I started taking Bulgarian lessons. I had 2 a week for about 18 months.
And your motivation was to translate
exactly.
Books.
Yes.
That's it's
Yeah.
strongly impacted you, the teaching.
Yeah, so it was very... And then I first went to Bulgaria in 1989, just before the wall came down. And it was a very different place then than it is now, because you had constant police checks, and our hosts, they had to go down the mountain to assure the authorities that we were still there every 2 or 3 days and get forms signed and everything. And we arrived in the camp in a very remote part of the mountains called Musala. Musala is the highest mountain in the Rila mountain range. It's 2,954 meters, and we were a bit further down, but in a place which had been camped in since the 1920s, so far as Peter Deunov was concerned. And we had a small group of about 8 or 9 of us, and then we got up at 5:30 in the morning to walk up to another ridge. It's about a 300 feet climb to see the sunrise from a little rock. And then once we'd seen the sunrise, and the sunrise is part of the symbolism of the Peter Deunov teaching, because the sun not only has to rise outside, but it has to rise inside. And there is a panurhythmy movement. The panurhythmy is a series of sacred dance movements choreographed with music by Peter Deunov. And one of them is sunrise, and it goes like that. So you can make a gesture corresponding to the journey from the heart through the throat chakra to the crown chakra.
So
and then
what does an
things
internal
out.
sunrise feel like?
It's the development of the light within. That's the essence of it.
Yeah.
I mean, there are 2 or 3 key symbols in the Peter Deunov teaching. One is the sunrise, the sun, and the sun being the center of the solar system and what it represents. And the second one is the grain of wheat. And so a tiny grain of wheat is planted in the ground, and it produces 100-fold. If it's not, there are only 2 things that can happen to the grain of wheat. Either it grows, or it's crushed and made into bread. And so the grain of wheat for Peter Deunov is a symbol of the soul and the journey of the soul. And so really we need to grow rather than get ourselves crushed. But then, there are these different episodes in life. And then the third one, which is also terribly important, is the spring. And there are various places in the mountains where the followers of Peter Deunov have created marble hands for the water to flow out of. And so you see the water coming out of these hands, being offered, as it were, by these marble hands, being sculpted by people. And that symbolizes the flow of life, and also another panurhythmic gesture of giving and receiving. And so doing the panurhythmy up in the mountains is one of my great experiences in life, because and seeing the sunrise and being in the Mount of Prayer. This is in the Rila, in the lakes, the Seven Lakes area. The first area I talked about is about an hour and a half away in a different part of the mountains. So the Seven Lakes camp was started in 1929, the first time. And by 1939, just before the war, there were 400 people attending the camp, and some from all over Europe. And so the life in the camp and the mountains symbolises a sort of intense version of normal everyday life, because it involves quite a lot of physical exertion. You have to get up. It's a wonderful tune that wakes you up in the morning, if you can hear it, if you're not just totally out of it. And then you go and watch the sunrise, and then you say some prayers, and you you sing some songs, and then there's a reading. It will be one of the talks by Peter Deunov in Bulgarian, which then people listen to for half an hour. Usually one of the talks he gave on the mountain, because he gave 7,000 talks altogether. It's 150 volumes of his work in Bulgarian originally. There's more even than that now. And then at 10 o'clock after breakfast, then you climb up to one of two areas to do the panurhythmy. So the centre of the panurhythmy is circle dance. And some people might have seen Michael Palin's account of it. People, so the musicians in the middle, probably 10 or 15 musicians with violins and guitars and flutes and various sort of things. And then you were in pairs all the way around. And you're in the middle of this vast landscape, this temple, perched on a flat area with mountains above and the plain below and lakes, and it's absolutely spectacular. And so the feeling of doing that with several hundred other people, these beautiful movements.
What did you feel inside?
It's just a tremendous sense of joy and connectedness.
Yeah, so you feel very connected with
absolutely
the environment.
You feel connected with the environment, you feel connected with the people, and you also feel connected with, as it were, a vertical dimension, the inner.
Yeah.
So it's a great thing for people to be able to experience.
We have about, look at the clock, we're whizzing through time and only covering this. We have about sort of 13 minutes left of the programme. So you obviously then, I think you moved on to Winchester. I say obviously, I know sequentially certainly.
Yes.
You started to teach philosophy at Winchester University, is that correct?
Winchester College.
Winchester College,
it was languages and a bit of philosophy.
Yeah. So, and obviously Peter was very influential in terms of developing where your career was going to go.
Yes, that's towards the end of it.
Yes.
Because I left Winchester in 1986 when I had this opportunity of becoming director of the Scientific and Medical Network. I also had the opportunity at the same time of becoming a co-director of Wrekin Trust. And I decided to go with the network job because I thought that there were more interesting possibilities for development.
So for people that don't know, what is the Scientific and Medical Network?
Well, the Scientific and Medical Network is an international forum of doctors, scientists, psychologists, complementary medicine practitioners, philosophers, economists, anyone really interested in a new world view and interested particularly in science and consciousness, science and spirituality, and the implications of healing and complementary medicine. And it was started by a small group of distinguished people in the early 1970s, including George Blaker, from whom I took over. He was the previous secretary of the network. And then there was the Vice-Chancellor of Surrey University, Peter Leggett, who was another mentor of mine, as mathematician. And then there was Sir Kelvin Spencer, who was chief scientist at the Ministry of Power. And then finally Dr. Patrick Shackleton, who was the Dean of Postgraduate Medicine at Southampton. And so what these people were thinking at the time was that science students and medical students are trained not only in science and medicine, but also in materialism. They're trained to think think materialistically, to become scientific materialists. And so these people thought, well, these two things need to be separated, because on the one hand, you've got the scientific method, empirical testing, hypotheses, and so on. On the other hand, you've got this ideology of scientism, which says that only material entities exist, and that any evidence for spirituality or spiritual dimension, or spiritual experience, or mystical experience, or parapsychology, it's absolute nonsense. It can be dismissed out of hand. And so these individuals all had experiences of their own, which had convinced them that there were other spiritual and mystical dimensions. And they thought it was important for young students in science and medicine in particular, but young people generally, to be exposed to this viewpoint.
Yes, well, I think it's very much a case of these days the different sides are coming together, and consciousness is meeting science much more, and you get the leading edge of consciousness, the leading edge of quantum physics, for instance. They come very close in terms of how they see matter and spirituality, and also the concern of where we're going as a human race on the planet as well.
I think a lot's happened in the last 20 years, because the Mystics and Scientists Conference, which was one of the flagship conferences of the network, that was started in 1978. And I've been running that program since 1988, roughly. But I even had input into it before. When I was teaching at Winchester, Malcolm Lazarus would ring me up and say, have you got any ideas? Who do you think we should get? Because I first went to Mystics and Scientists in 1981, as a paying audience member. And it's strange to think that, within not that many years, I was chairing these conferences and putting them on, when I thought they were fantastic. I was so enthusiastic when I found out about Ken Wilber and Charlie Tart and all these people that have been so influential in the movement.
And where do you see it going the next few years, the network?
Well, I think that we published a number of books over the last few years, and just our most recent book is called A New Renaissance. It was launched last week, first weekend of November. And Transforming Science, Spirit and Society, a modest subtitle. And so we've done a number of conferences on this theme of a new Renaissance. And so we like to build on that theme with other organizations, because we can't do it all. Other organizations are doing other parts of it. If it's all about developing and articulating a new worldview, and therefore a new understanding of consciousness and science, then other organizations like the Soil Association and the New Economics Foundation and the Temenos Academy, they're playing equally important parts. So I think we need to try and coordinate the various efforts in this direction a little more effectively than they are at the moment.
It's a big challenge, really, isn't it?
It's a big challenge.
Because the planet is not liking what we're doing to it. It's kind of giving us all these signs, and we seem to be very resistant and very slow to adapt. Have you got any theories on that?
Yes.
Why that the case is?
Well, it's really the what's happening in nature, or what's happening in economics, is by definition a reflection of the assumptions and approach and the worldview that informs it. And so, since the 17th century, we've had a mechanistic understanding of the universe. Universe is a machine, where machines, the machine metaphor has dominated. And that has corresponded to a science that has developed into manipulating nature, and an economics which is about exploiting nature. So when you put all that together, power of science and the primacy of economics, then you get an ideology of economic growth. And economic growth is not sustainable in its present form, so far as the planet is concerned. So the paradigm of economic growth is on a collision course with Gaia. And as E.R. Schumacher famously said, if humanity takes on nature, we'll find ourselves on the losing side.
There's no doubt about that, yeah.
That's the most important reason why we need a new worldview. And it's one of the reasons why there's the work I did on with the Prince of Wales and on the Prince of Wales in my book Radical Prince, because he also shares this view. He's got a book that's recently come out.
That's right. Yeah.
And his book called Harmony is subtitled A New Way of Looking at the World.
Yeah.
So he sees an urgent need for a new world view. But the new world view is countercultural. In other words, it's like the 60s, corresponds a bit to the 60s counterculture, or it corresponds to the Romantic movement, or it corresponds to Goethe versus Newton in science. Or the reaction. So what the Romantics were saying is we've lost our connection with nature. We need to reconnect with nature. We need to harmonise with nature, work in harmony with nature.
Well, we think we're separate, don't we? That's
also a
problem.
part of the scientific mechanistic worldview, the detached observer. And so we actually want to balance out our
we're not even
views.
a detached observer, we're just detached and
we're detached and rampant. Exactly.
If we were a detached observer, we might actually see what was going on.
Yes, it would be useful in that sense to zoom out
and really see, but we don't even do that. We're just zooming around. And
so I think and if something is unsustainable, then it can't be sustained in the long run. And so I think we're going to see some interruptions to our way of life.
Are we going to get it, do you think, in time?
I doubt it. My friend Sir Crispin Tickell, who's a leading environmentalist, he puts it rather well. He says that in order for things to change, we're going to need leadership from vision from above, pressure from below, and a few catastrophes to concentrate the mind.
Yeah.
And so I think the way that human beings work is that when we need to be faced with, as it were, an ultimatum before we change.
Yeah.
It's not that we don't know what we should be doing, but we also have these systems that are short-term. And so our economic system is short-term. What's the next quarterly figures? And our political democratic system is short-term. How can I get re-elected?
Yeah. We have to finish in 3 or 4 minutes. I just want to chip in, because I have quite a strong view on this, just to get your response to it.
Yes.
I've thought about this a lot, and I think it can be distilled down to something very simple. Maybe it's oversimple, but it's like we all, on the inside, feel incomplete. And we don't know that, a lot of us, people who are on more of a spiritual path like you and me, we have more idea that is the case. But most people, they just, especially in these days of reality TV and people becoming celebrities who haven't really done very much to deserve, in my view, to become celebrities, it's like everyone knows that this, wherever they are, isn't it. And unfortunately, we seem to be more and more wanting to consume on the outside. We want to expand on the outside to fill these gaping holes on the inside. And that seems to me where it all goes wrong, because, as you say, quite rightly, I feel the planet is, what we're doing is unsustainable. And until we really go in and feel and start to understand, then actually we don't even have a starting point.
No, I think I'd agree with that. What you described is very similar to what Ken Wilber calls the Atman Project, where he says that there's a striving towards this completeness or wholeness, if you like, and there are various substitutes for it on the way. So consumerism or reality TV or whatever it is, these can be substitutes, but it's like what Augustine said, there's a God-shaped hole in the human being, and the only ultimate fulfillment is for the divine to be recognised and integrated in the human being, and then that longing is satisfied. That incompleteness is satisfied. So I don't think anything on the human plane can actually fill that gap.
So it's the divine being integrated in the human being.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it means the connection between the human and the divine, and the recognition of that connection, and the realization of it, which also means, because if you realize it in yourself, it means you've realized that other people are yourselves. So we are each other.
Absolutely.
And that is the basis of the golden rule.
And this here, although this
Yes.
one has to be, it's plastic.
Yeah,
It's still-
exactly.
yeah.
Yes. So I think that's a key realization.
Okay, David, we need to finish. I really appreciate you coming in and giving your time and
Oh, it's
talking
a
about your
pleasure.
life. I plug some of your books at the end. I was going to mention again this magazine, the Network Review, Scientific and Medical Network, because my wife Renata and I have got a lot out of belonging to this organisation, and I do find the articles, and particularly the book reviews, quite fascinating. There's many books that I've actually ended up buying that David has reviewed. He is an incredible reader, and he's a very good reviewer, very precise his reviews. So thank you again for coming along and chatting with us here, Conscious TV. Thank you for watching, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.